Hey, peace and another beautiful day with the Brother Garfield podcast. We have my partner today, Brother Ankh, known as the God Killer, of course, from the pseudo killers and the community of skeptics. And of course, you're watching the Brother Garfield podcast. Today we have a special guest. He's been on here over 3 to 4 times already. You guys are familiar with him and his book. His book is Soul of Judaism. Let me just put a picture on the screen in the meantime so people get familiarized. And again, purchase the book. I think as far as Judaism and African Americans and the connection, it's probably the best book on the market right now. If you haven't gotten it yet, go and grab the book. It's a great read. Although I bought the hardcover book, I actually have it on my Kindle also. So sometime when I need to remember anything, I just pull it out of my phone. So shout out to Dr. Bruce Haynes for producing such a wonderful work. But before I bring him up, I want to reintroduce him to the community. He is a professor of sociology at the University of UC Davis, and he's a scholar of racial and ethnic relations and urban communities. Bruce Haynes' work seeks to understand the process of racialization and the consequences of racial classification for creating communities' boundaries, particularly within urban context. All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, reintroducing for probably the fifth time, Dr. Bruce Haynes. How you doing today, my brother?
I'm very good today. Thank you, Brother Garfield, for having me back again. It's a pleasure
Yes,
to be here.
it's a pleasure. It's a pleasure. How was your Black History Month so far for you and what you've been doing?
It's been good. It's been good. It's been a hectic month. I'm teaching. I'm actually teaching a class on race in America, and so there's plenty to talk about. I'm never lost with something to talk about.
Let me ask you this: Do you do your regular class every semester? Is it about race normally?
Yes, I teach what used to be called, when I first began, I've been doing this 30 years now, used to be called race relations. Many scholars decided that was a term that was dated, that suggested that racial groups were equal when they're not. And so people use different terms to refer to the field now. Some refer to it as the sociology of race and ethnicity. Some refer to it as critical race. My perspective is I have taken a critical approach to the question of race my whole career. But I've never defined myself as a critical race theorist per se. Okay. So these terms, once they make it out into the public domain, they take on different meanings than they might mean even to scholars. So for instance, critical race came out of the law field and is really their term that morphed into other places.
Okay. All right. So you are all right. So in this semester, your previous semester or your current semester, you have an upcoming starting semester, I should say. Or
well, we're in a quarter system. So we're in the 7th week of our quarter, and then we have another 10-week spring quarter that will come up in late March.
Okay. So in your semester teaching as far as race is concerned, do you teach about race as far as it being a social construct or?
For sure.
Okay.
For sure.
I just want to give the audience an idea of what your expertise is as a
what I try to do is give substance to that kind of what ends up an empty phrase, right? Well, socially constructed, what does that mean? So I try to bring some rigor to bear on that idea.
All right, cool. Now, are there any projects that you're currently working on? Is there a new book, a new documentary? What are you working on? Anything new?
Well, I've become interested. I think we're living through really interesting political times, very dangerous political times. I believe democracy is under threat in very similar ways that democracy was under threat at the beginning of the 20th century. There are so many things about the early 20th century that looks like the current period: the rise of the KKK, violence against Black people, rising anti-Semitism, rising nationalism. These forces are the forces that I think really most threaten Black people around the globe.
Okay. All right. So I'm gonna bring my brother Ankh in, and he's going to have a few questions for you. But I just
All
wanted
right,
to
I'll
give
do
a
my best.
background of who you are, and because we're having this conversation in the community, which is just crazy right now. People losing friendships right now with this conversation. It has to do with claiming Israel. It has to do with claiming ancient Egypt, and people trying to superimpose our whole racialization of blackness and put it in ancient times, which we think is anachronistic, but they feel that the ancient Egyptians were all black, and the ancient Israelites, for the folks who are Hebrew Israelites, they're claiming that all the Israelites were black. So it's they're not understanding as far as the term black and its usage. So let me bring my brother Ankh in, and he could start his line of questioning. Brother Ankh, are you there, my brother? Brother, yes, sir. All right, the floor is yours, my brother.
All right, how you doing, Dr. Bruce? How you feel?
I'm feeling great. Thank you, brother.
Thank you for allowing us to have this healthy conversation. And like I said before, my first question is to Todd. I basically want to hear an expert stance on this issue. I always feel like it's important for our scholars and experts to wade in on conversations that novices have in the community, and so I'm appreciating you for this. So my thing is this: I'm arguing that in ancient cultures, ancient African cultures, that they would not have applied the racialized term "black people" to them, based off the fact it was a term that was brought actually in by colonialism. This is where my research actually takes me. So I want to ask you, do I have any grounding in what I'm saying? Am I making any sense?
Well, I can only draw on the literature that I know. I feel I do know a fairly good amount of literature, but I don't claim to know everything. But from my knowledge base, the idea of race is a idea that really emerged in the modern world, emerged simultaneously with colonialism. In fact, you could talk about the rise of colonial studies in academia over the past decade as a direct reflection of how important this idea of colonialism and its tie to race has become. The other idea that scholars often talk about, which is also a complicated idea, is the linkage of race with capitalism. And so scholars also talk about racial capitalism. But race is, by and large, a term that was a cultural term, then a scientific term, and then became a political term. And it's embeddedness in political systems that I believe give it its importance in the modern world.
It's a great answer right there. I appreciate that. So, what type of politics would it have taken in the ancient world to even begin to start to add value, racializing people's skin color? Would that type of politics existed? Would those type
Well,
of stereotypes been in?
so here's an interesting question, okay? From what I know about the history of slavery, slavery has been going on for all recorded history between the Arab world and the Sudan, right? So through Egypt all the way down to Khartoum, Black bodies have been, heading northward and into the East for all known history. But it seems that color was not the determining factor in deciding who was going to be a slave and who was not. So, for example, the term slave itself comes from Slav, and that's because Slavic people were heavily enslaved prior to Black people being enslaved. So even the term slave does not come from Black people enslavement, it comes from Slavic people being enslaved. And we say Slavic people, we're talking about people in Eastern Europe.
Yeah, I actually understand that right there, and that makes sense. Yeah, so the Slavs was his first slaves. That's real interesting. And so you talk about. Go ahead.
No, well, one of the things I can't say I have I've written about this, but I've come to think in these terms that one of the things that for me signifies the significant change in the modern world with regards to slavery itself is that prior to the 1500s, anybody could be a slave. Christians could be slaves. Jews, in fact, could be slaves. People could sell themselves into slavery to pay off debts. We had a very biblical driven world. And if you look at the Bible, slavery is there everywhere. When we get to the modern world, the shift to African bodies, because remember, they first tried to enslave the native peoples. The Spaniards did. Many people forget
Correct.
that failed, and because they tried to enslave them on their own territory. So they decided, well, better to enslave people and move them to new territory where they are less comfortable. And so this turn to, in fact, the Arab slave trade, which was in existence in the 1400s. It's actually, from my understanding, the French who begin to conquer Morocco and head down the western coast of Africa in a city called Ceuta, if I remember correctly. And that's where they first take their first slave ship. That was a Moroccan slave ship, and take that ship back to Europe. And it sort of sparks a new interest. And it's at that point that the transatlantic slave trade gets started and would very soon overcome the Arab slave trade as the source of slaves in the modern world.
So, okay, yeah, that's all right. That's very, very interesting, right? So the actual
So the
so
shift to the
what would be
modern
the meaning?
slavery is
Oh,
racial slavery. That's the
okay,
key.
right,
And it's
gotcha.
tied to capitalism. That's what changes. That human beings become property, human beings become sold like cattle, human beings
Okay,
become part of the industrial infrastructure for production. That is what changes from the old feudal era to
uh-huh,
modern day slavery.
got. So can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so um, what would be the purpose of racializing something? What is that process of actually
Well, think about it.
racializing?
We have, like, you ever thought about the idea? It's funny, this came into my attention just a few years ago. This notion of white slavery, I started becoming interested in. Like, why is this conversation in the West about white slavery? And I came to learn that this was the taboo that emerged sort of coincidentally, or not coincidentally, but in juxtaposition to the emergence of the slave trade. And so, this sort of new ways of thinking about human beings emerges as we try to justify treating human beings like we do in the slave regime. And so you could one way of thinking about race is that it allows you to not feel so bad about placing some people into a degraded circumstance. The Nazis used the same logic to justify the extermination of Jews, that the creation of the ghettos during Nazi Germany was an attempt to create Jews in such a destitute circumstances that anybody looking at them would think that these people are subhuman. And this is part of the strategy of slave regimes.
So racialization actually
When
places
I say
value.
slave regimes, I mean race regimes. Our race regimes happened to impose slavery.
Hmm.
Right? Our
So
race regime did not have to have slavery. It could have also had some other kind of second-class citizenship for Black people, right? It didn't have to have slavery. Slavery
okay.
was simply part of an economic machine. And in fact, that's why Black folks were drawn here, right? We
Absolutely.
became part of that industrial triangular trade.
So now actually what I hear you saying is they place value and put themselves at the top of the chart. White was
Precisely.
right and black was dirty. That's crazy.
Precisely. For me, in American society, the most important law outside of the Constitution itself is the 1790 Naturalization Act. Because right after the establishment of the nation, Congress realized that they weren't really clear about who could be a citizen. And they clearly wanted a white nation. And so they decided they needed to make a Naturalization Act to make it clear that only free white persons could become citizens. And that was true for even Asian Americans up into the 1950s. So Asian Americans who came in the 19th century, who were now, 70 years old, were not able to become American citizens.
Huh. So could you think of any circumstance that maybe the ancient cultures in the Nile Valley, or say ancient Israel, would have placed that type of color value? Do you find it in the biblical text?
So let me say this. I think the problem here is presuming that race is about color. So in other words, color is a signifier of racial difference, but race fundamentally is about an ideology or a set of ideas about difference that is very much tied to dehumanization. And so we see these processes in other, what we might refer to as ethnic circumstances, say with the Hutu in their country, with, right? So, the Hutu and the Tutsis, there was physical similarity between the two groups, cultural and ethnic distinction that had been created over time through colonialism. Mm-hmm. And so that is the racial process, that process by which those groups came to see themselves as groups. And so the structure of a society kind of decides the importance of race. So an interesting book I think every Black person should read, actually, is a book called How the Irish Became White. And why I say that is because it shows how the Irish, the only colonized people in Europe, they saw themselves as oppressed by the British. The British treated them as and called them racially other. In fact, often compared them to simians and apes, much like Black Americans and Black people have been compared to apes. And so there was this racialization of the Irish. So when the Irish immigrated to the United States, they were somewhat on the sort of bottom of the European totem pole, so to speak, and they were looking for a leg up. And it's for that reason that the Irish readily embraced whiteness as they sought to escape the stigmatized status that they had back home. And here in America, naturalization said, yes, indeed, you are white people, eligible to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act, eligible to get property from the Homestead Act. All of those things were made eligible through naturalization, through their recognition, through recognizing them as white persons. So it starts with that political recognition and then evolves into the identities of people over time.
All right.
In the same way that Black people were not Negroes when we started out, right? We were, Fulani and from, a dozen different tribes. And the notion of becoming Negro emerged out of our similar political circumstances. And so in a sense, that's how we can see racial formation in action. 1620, those Negroes did not identify with each other, came from different places. 1920, Du Bois and people are talking about the new brown Negro and constructing new ideas about how Black people would reconstitute identities in the 20th century.
That seems like a catchment of power right there, putting together a structure that would give them power over indigenous people. So that's basically what they
and that what you say there is also important. There are two systems at work in colonialism. One places Black people at the bottom of a racial scale. The other tends to place indigenous people at the bottom of the racial scale. So there are different ways of classifying. So indigeneity should not be ignored when we talk about this process of racialization. You know, because all of these indigenous people are also racialized as physically and morally different, and thus that justifies all sorts of behavior towards them.
Yeah, they put the. Hold on, let me 1 sec. Go ahead, Garfield.
Yeah, and another thing with the Irish too is that we call them the Black Irish, and it's funny in the Gaelic language, Black is like the person who is the devil. They're looked at as evil, so they call Black people blue in the Gaelic language, which is it's just a weird thing with that Gaelic language. So in Jamaica, they had this book about the Irish family moving to Jamaica, and it was this blonde-haired guy. I'm like, the Black Irish in Jamaica, and you see a blonde-haired, blue-eyed guy. I'm like, wow, what's going on here? But he was from Irish, and his family was Irish. You know, so that goes back to the whole trying to denigrate those people, the Irish, the British, China, you know, and they were treated badly too by the British in the British colonial atmosphere. So,
and because of that history of colonialism, Blackness has emerged in fascinating ways all around the globe. I met a woman last fall. I went to Ireland for the first time, Dublin, and I met a Black scholar at Trinity College who was a mixed race of African descent and Irish descent, and she was studying her people essentially. And she told me a fascinating story about mixed race people who were born in the 60s and 70s, and in a context of strong Catholic moral norms and a bit of racism, and she's studying that amongst the Afro-Irish. Now, I did not know there were Afro-Irish, that there were enough people of African descent for them to come to create an Afro-Irish identity. And so you see this kind of multiplicity of identities that have been shaped through the African diaspora, shaped as a result of colonialism, shaped as a result of Black bodies being spread across the globe.
I have
and when I say Black bodies, I mean African bodies that we now call Black.
Okay, I got you. So where my studies take me to start to realize that indigenous people didn't actually consider themselves to be Black people. I know they had their own indigenous names and stuff like that. Am I in proper cue with that, or am I off?
Well, see, now it depends on which indigenous people you're talking about, actually. Okay. So in the United States, I think that's very much true.
Okay.
And it has to do with our particular colonial relationships. But I have recently learned that in Polynesia, in Micronesia, during the 1960s, when the Black Panther Party was moving, and Black nationalism, so to quote, I don't really like that term nationalism, but for lack of a better term, Black nationalism was emerging. You see those ideas going global to Brazil, to Jamaica, and even to Polynesia, where these people identified with the Black movement.
So, you know what the question should have been? Outside of the yoke of colonialism. So, okay. So, you know what? I understand how African Americans, Black Americans, have actually taken that term Black, right, for a term of endurance, as a way of standing up against the oppression, right? You say my skin is dirty and I'm ugly. I say I'm Black and I'm proud. So that's a response, right, to racism, white supremacy, right? And so I ask again.
It's a political response to the context.
Politics, okay. So I ask again, those indigenous cultures in ancient times, right? There wouldn't have been a race politics to even have to fight against that. Am I right or wrong on
Correct.
that?
Correct.
Okay.
Which is why we have occasional blacks running around Elizabethan England. It's why we have a group of Spanish blacks are running around Europe earlier than most people think. 1400s, there are still black people in Europe. So despite this notion of the Middle Ages and a complete severance from Africa, that's not really completely true. There are still Africans, particularly by the early 1400s, 1420, 1430. There are definitely Africans in Spain and in Amsterdam and other places. Mm-hmm. So not in great numbers. In fact, I recently learned that they were in Ireland as well. I did not know this, but someone recently who is expert in Irish history actually told me about the African that goes back further than people have realized. And so Africans have been around the world for a long time. So the notion that we only went around the world with slavery, I think, is also maybe a misnomer.
It's another topic for discussion, ain't it?
Indeed.
Separate. I like to be in.
You know what? I want to get back to something else you said, which is really interesting, and I never thought of it this way. You said, well, outside of colonialism, when you go outside of colonialism, who's the bad guy? Who's the boogeyman? Mm-hmm. And we know what's really interesting. Most people don't seem to understand that that has historically been, in the Western world, Jews.
Okay.
Jews have been the historic other in the Western context, and in quite an iconic kind of way. And so what I mean, so we can trace this all the way back to Shakespeare and The Merchant of Venice and the character of Shylock, which is a stereotypical Jewish character with a long nose, and he's grubby and he wants money, and so he has stereotypes that are quite contemporary of Jews. So we can see how far back in Western culture this notion of Jews being somehow tied to evil and money and corruption and control, those ideas go way, way back. And so part of understanding, and this is funny how this comes full circle, why I believe nationalism is so an important issue in the modern world, because we see how racism and anti-Semitism are intimate for nationalist movements. You don't even need Jews or black people, but your nationalist movement is often predicated on this sort of the imagined Jew or the imagined black. And so this is exactly the kind of construction Trump has constructed with his idea of Jews somehow leading the immigrants into America, Jews somehow leading some sort of conspiracy against white people to be this communist infiltration that will somehow undo all the good things that we have in society. Those are ideas that have a long, long history that actually predate anti-blackness, but become intertwined with anti-blackness as black signifiers are used to signify Jews as bad. Jewish signifiers sometimes are used to signify black people as bad. And so we see at different times, for instance, drawing Jews very dark. You see this in medieval artwork. There's this sort of blackening of Jewish caricatures. That's one of the ways of talking about them as a disgraced people who were responsible for killing the Christ.
What? Well, hold on. Okay, that's interesting. So you said the blackening of it. So it didn't signify the Africanness.
Well, see, it's not totally clear. They painted as dark. You see, like Europeans regularly painted the other as dark. The Ottomans are dark. Wow. Everybody from the East is dark.
Wow.
And see, what I try to argue in my book, which is a little bit different, I take Edward Said's idea about Orientalism that is only applied to the Arab world. And I think that's a mistake. Jews are just as Semitic as Arabs. They all speak Semitic languages. They all come from that region.
I agree.
Right? And so Jews have been part of the same racialized narrative of Eastern peoples right up until the 20th century, when they got to kind of cross symbolically the American color line. But in Europe, they still consider Jews other, as very clearly demonstrated in Hungary, in Poland, in Ukraine, in Nazi Germany.
Okay, so what about those Russian icons? You talk about artwork. Aren't those Russian icons, aren't they kind of dark, some of them?
What do you mean Russian icons?
What am I talking about, Garfield? In the artwork, Orthodox Christianity in Russia.
Yeah, those are after medieval time, though. They're late. They're pretty late.
They're late. The Russian icons are late.
Icons are late. Yeah, they're painting a lot of things dark. The people are dark skinned and all that stuff.
Yeah, but he give a good. That's interesting. The answer he kind of gave for that. That's interesting. So, okay, Dr. Bruce, I got a question actually from a brother, in our server.
Okay.
He says, here's the question. Best. This is Brother Logic. He says, for a community or individual that seeks to gain self-confidence and a self-identity from, from including themselves in the accomplishment of other African people, are there any better ways for the community or individual to gain self-confidence? I guess he's basically.
Wow. That's a great question. I'd probably be a superstar if I had a great answer for that question. Anthony Appiah, he's a philosopher, a Black philosopher, African descent at Harvard. He talked about the impossibility of Africa to unite because it is just too diverse. 5,000 different languages spoken on the continent. You know, like the vast differences in culture, in phenotype, even, and so we even have a homogenized African in our mind when we say African, right? There are a lot of people somehow we cut out of Africa who are indigenous Africans when we think of who the Africans are, because we think of who the Africans are through that colonial prism.
Man, so there's no one way to be African. Very diverse, most diverse gene pool on planet Earth.
Well, yes, and yet at the same time, you could argue that there are continuities across African cultures that
I meant in biology.
That are real.
I meant in biology. I meant biology.
But yeah, biologically, we are. It's funny when people talk about Black people as the original people. I do believe that, but I believe that in a more scientific way. I believe that the origin of mankind is out of Africa. It's probably out of Eastern Africa from all of the evidence that we have. I've been fairly convinced that the Bantu-speaking people might be the oldest human population, a modern human population. Those are the people who have modern click languages, that ancient click languages that do not connect to any of the global languages. They have a completely unique language that they believe is an ancient language. They also have genetics that goes way back genetically in terms of the history of their genetics. And so I'm convinced that modern man, pretty much walked out of Africa and peopled Asia and peopled Europe. And it was a process that took, thousands of generations and tens of thousands of years. And we're all one big family.
Oh, yeah, I absolutely support the out of Africa theory. I'm a valued reader of Charles Darwin's work, and I even understand how in his first work he didn't even use humans, because he understood that in those time periods people couldn't even actually fathom that. They was all off into their religion, like either Judaism, where with Adam and Eve, the garden. So most Europeans thought that, and most indigenous culture felt like that's where they came from. So his idea was very, very groundbreaking in that. Matter of fact, we probably can't even find an idea like that now. I mean, something that would be remotely close to what everybody just can't fathom. That's very interesting.
Okay, so bro, let me tell you, I believe science is our best chance of knowing things, right? Because it's a rational, deliberate attempt at understanding something. I got interested in this idea about tracing groups back, tracing Blackness back in time, tracing Jews back in time. And I started looking at population geneticists because they moved away from talking about race. They're talking about DNA now. It's all about genetics and DNA and who's related to whom. And so they really talk about population genetics where they can trace they can make theories about human migration based on the genetic profiles of people. And so when they've done that, there's a wonderful movie I encourage you to take a look at. It's on the web, on YouTube. It's called I might have to get the name for it. I think it's called The Origins of Man. The scholar's name is Spencer Wells.
Oh, absolutely. Geneticist. Spencer Wells. He's part of the Genome Project.
Exactly.
Yeah, with part of Human Genome Project.
His Italian professor, mentor at Stanford, and their story of tracing population genetics. I use that movie every year. I teach in a university that's very science oriented. If I start with culture and history, I'm going to lose my sciencey students. But if I start with genetics and let them know, we're going to talk about the real stuff here, I got their attention.
Yeah, you got my attention.
And then I talk about color, because we have to really understand color is really a reflection of the sun and protecting us from the sun, and is not limited to Africa. So all the peoples who live near the equator are dark. That includes people in Micronesia and Polynesia and places that genetically are very distant from us genetically. But they look like us, like the Aborigine, another group. We would say they look like us because they're dark people. Genetically, they are Asian. Their genetics go back to Asia in the same way my genetics go back to Africa. And so we often have racialized our understanding of people on the planet through the people who we come to know. And often that gives us a very skewed idea about race and tends to reinforce our ideas about race.
Are you familiar with
I meet people from Tongan nations, and I think of them as Black people. They don't think of me as a Black person, right? And so even my understanding of race is somewhat contingent upon assessing color in our society.
Yeah, American.
So if you look as Black, and but he says I'm this, right? And so it's not my place to tell him, no, you're really Black here, right? Am I that? You know what I'm saying? So identities are a lot more complicated. Racial identities are not just about color. Something more to constructing race than color. Jews look many ways like many Europeans, but the Germans created Nuremberg laws based on our miscegenation laws. They copied our laws that said you can't marry white people. They said Jews can't marry Germans. And just like they said, well, if your grandfather's Black and from Africa, you're Black. That's what they said about Jews. If your grandfather's a Jew, you're a Jew. So they biologized Jewishness, just like we biologized Blackness. And often,
interesting. So, all right. So you talk about, so they put like, they made it seem as if it was biology, a biological reason for being Jewish. So it's really not. Hold on, one thing.
If I traced your identity through your ancestry, I'm making you a race.
Yeah.
Black people are made Black in part through the one drop rule.
All right, hold on. Let me say this. Let me make this point. Wow, I really wanted to ask a greater question. So with the Jewishness, right? That's actually, would you consider that to be, well, you talked about how the Arabs and all those, they speak Arabs and stuff. They kind of speak Semitic languages, right?
Correct.
Kind of
Arabic is a Semitic language.
Right.
Hebrew is a Semitic language. In fact, Ge'ez from Ethiopia is a Semitic language.
All right. And so you wouldn't actually you wouldn't racialize that your Jewishness then. Because
How could you?
Because you could be a Muslim.
Precisely.
You don't have to be Jew.
Precisely. But in the way that if I made everybody who says Muslim today, if I define their Muslimness through their genetic line, then I'm sort of biologizing our understanding of who they are. And that's what I mean by constructing the racial.
I got it now. That's why I asked that question, because I wanted to make sure I was catching on. Are you familiar with the work of Nina Jablonski? She did the work on skin color from Penn State. Look her up, Nina Jablonski. Yeah, that's because you talked about sunscreen, melanin. It's basically sunscreen, protecting you from UVA rays and UV.
Exactly.
Rays. Yeah, absolutely.
Around the equator, not limited to Africa.
Folic acid.
And they're light-skinned Africans who are indigenous to Africa.
Right, correct. Now
what?
Got you. So I would also like to say, you talked about the Bantu speakers, but what about the Khoisan? They seem to have the oldest DNA on planet Earth.
Right, because I meant the Khoisan.
I want to correct that.
I stand corrected.
All right, okay. Right. I want to get that straight. That was sitting right here. I was like, man, I know did he say that? I said, I got to double back on that. Khoisan.
Glad you're listening.
Absolutely. I appreciate the conversation, man. And I know what it's supposed to sound like. So when you said that, I was like, man.
You're right. You're totally right.
All right.
Okay. And they're in that movie, in fact.
Oh, okay. Yes.
The movie that you were referencing, right? Yeah. They're in that movie and featured in that movie. So, and I'm drawing from that movie heavily, but I'm also drawing from my own scholarship. I haven't found any scholarship that refutes that movie.
No, you're right there. And South Africa, it's interesting that the oldest people would be in South Africa, though, isn't it?
Exactly.
All right.
Exactly. So I believe Great Zimbabwe is quite possibly connected to ancient Jews through groups like the Lemba. Yeah. So
the Lemba. So you think some males migrated down?
Well, in other words, I'm saying it's all speculation. It's all speculation.
I'm about to say, go ahead, explain that. Go ahead.
And I think, one of the things that I found interesting in reading history is how much speculation, in fact, there was in history.
Okay.
That, we have this fact, we have this fact, we have this fact, so we draw this conclusion. A lot of times we're stretching the conclusion, and people accept it as fact, and it gets repeated as fact as long as it kind of stays fashionable until someone else can, knock it off its pedestal. But and so that's what I found, for instance, in debates about whether or not Jews were in Ethiopia during the 4th century. The evidence could go either way. You could read the evidence that there were definitely Jews there, or you could read the evidence that no, these people just believed that they were Jews. Who knows? Well, the question is, does it matter? Right? There are other questions, right? Because if they're living lives based on their beliefs, does it matter if they're not genetically any more different than that's not my genetics that's determining me being black right now. It's really, me looking black.
All right. I got one more question for you.
Okay.
Also from Brother Logic, he's in a pseudo killer army. We actually have a community that's grounded in scientific literacy. This is what we do, right? Because we understand that if we are natural people, then the best thing that human beings have created is science, which is the study of nature. So we feel like scientific literacy is a way to kind of understand ancient cultures, who we are and where we fit in the world. So his question, he says, how important was the role of cultural retention and continuity for other people groups who also had overcome racism while achieving economic stability, such as the Chinese railroad workers in the late 1800s?
Wow, that's a good question. I don't know that much about the Chinese workers, but I do know that Chinatowns and barrios and sort of the first real urban Black concentrated neighborhoods that we could call ghettos emerged in the late 19th century, a time that was highly violent, a time when many white communities were driving their racial people out of town. Right, we had sundown towns emerging all over America, and we had the Klan marching out, even out here in California in the early teens. And so, they experienced some of that terror just like we did, except for Black people, it was always the extreme, right? There was an occasional Chinese person that got lynched. Leo Frank, a Jewish guy, got lynched down south, but they were pretty rare instances, right? Compared to the regular lynchings of Black bodies, which posed almost a moral threat to white America in the post-slavery era, right? I mean, white Americans were fearful of Black people, and their response to our presence reflected that fear.
All right, I got a good question.
Fear that Blacks might retaliate, right? I mean, there's an underlying fear in America ever since slavery that Black people might actually retaliate.
Same way with the Jewish community in Germany, am I correct? They was thinking maybe they would like overthrow something, take the finances. What was their fear?
Well, no, Germany. Germany's deep. Germany, you got to start with World War I, the state of German society at the end of World War I. The German military was devastated. Germany was sort of embarrassed. It was a defeated nation. There were many Jews who had been living in Germany for decades. Quite many who were not even religiously Jewish, just like many Jews here in America today.
Not religiously Jewish. Okay.
Exactly. But many of them were in the arts. Many were in jazz. Many were in the art world as artists and creators of art. And so there was a certain persecution blaming of the failure of German culture on Jews. So they were blamed for modernity itself. They were modern art was confiscated and rounded up. The Germans created a museum of art called Encarta Kunst that was an attempt to characterize Jews as morally dejected, degenerate. That's the word, degenerate. That they had moral degeneracy, and that's the term that they used, in fact. This was part of the propaganda machine that was driving the eventual extermination of Jews, right? Because in order to justify exterminating Jews, part of the Reich tried to show Jews and why they were such a problem to society. So that included creating the ghettos and making them, as poor and destitute as possible. That included rounding up their art. And of course, some of that art was very valuable and became sort of part of the Nazi loot that became infamous to this day, that people are still searching for the large amounts of art stolen from Jews who were German art dealers in Germany. And so the Germans resented this Jewish success. So they blamed just like we hear today. Why are we talking about Jews when we're talking about the social problems we have in our society today? I don't know what Jews have anything to do with it, but when you look at the right, they're blaming Jews. And so that narrative has been a part of 20th century nationalism, nation building, right? And it's Sometimes it's been Jews. Other times it's been Black folks who are the racial others who needed to be outside of the state. Mm-hmm. So take, for instance, South Africa and the formation of the South African state in the 20th century. We see them following, in many ways, the American model, mm-hmm. which, in fact, the Germans were following, the American model, racial hierarchy.
Sure was.
German Volk at the top, everybody else, the gypsies out, the gays are out, the Jews are out. And in fact, they're so far out, we need to exterminate them.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's just horrible. That's horrible.
Now, keep in mind, this is something I also didn't quite understand until recently. Mm-hmm. There are only 200,000 Jews in Germany. Mm-hmm. There weren't that many Jews in Germany. Most of the Jews in Europe were in the eastern part of the country, of the continent.
Okay.
In Hungary, in Poland, in Russia, in the Ukraine. And so when Hitler decided he was going to basically take over Eastern Europe, just like the Americans took over the West, mm-hmm. right? They're using the American model. This is colonialism 101, right? It's our land for the taking. Mm-hmm. They needed to clear out all those people in Eastern Europe. What are you going to do with them?
Oh, man. Yeah,
that's why the extermination.
Mm-hmm. It's horrible.
That's why 6 million Jews needed to be exterminated to make room for the expansion. No different than the extermination of Native Americans in the colonial expansion in North America.
Horrible. Let me, I got a question to ask you, and I want to know how do you explain this? Wait, am I saying this right? What is your response to me making this statement? What would you say? Based off of American standards in the 1930s, right? The Egyptians and the Hebrews, right, would be considered Black people. How would you break that down? What does that actually mean? What does that actually mean?
So,
you want me to answer it again?
The term Hebrew gets complicated.
Say it again.
The term Hebrew gets complicated.
All right, let's get off that. I'm just trying to show, because we know African Americans try to say they Black people, and African Americans want to say that the Egyptians are Black. They won't use these racialized terms, right? And so I want to say, so the thing is, based off of American standards in the 1940s, 1930s, right? You would say that they are Black people. What is that? How would you break that down?
No, I wouldn't say they're Black people. I would say they're racialized. It's very different.
Okay.
This is really the key thing. Okay. We must disentangle color from race. Color is not okay. Let me say this. How did I put it? Race is an asymmetrical set of relationships in America. So if a Black person and a white person intermarry, we don't say that person is half white and half Black. We say that person is all Black. That's
okay.
The one drop rule.
Okay, I see you answering the question, though. I see how you're doing it. Go ahead.
If a Native person and a white person intermarry, we say that person became white. That's what I mean by the asymmetrical relationship. Whiteness is a protected category. Blackness is where you shove all those people who you don't want in your white category too. So like all those mixed people now Black. Catch my drift? So now it's not about color, is it?
No.
It's about classification and what classification you are in. Just like Mr. Homer Plessy.
Wow.
He was white enough to get into the white car until the conductor came. Everybody thought it was fine. Right? So in a sense, Plessy Ferguson decision did exactly what the Nazis' Nuremberg laws did, which is say, well, if your great-great-grandfather's Black, I'm sorry, I mean, this Negro, no matter how white you are Black too.
Wow.
Thus, it's not about color, is it?
Man, I like the way you answered that question.
It's about classification.
I did not expect you to answer that question like that. Garfield, I'm done. Anything past this, I can mess that up. I don't want to mess that up.
One thing you got to look
Garfield.
at too is about the whole thing in Europe and the Jewish community and their classification, because remember,
and the Gypsies. Let's not forget the Roma. The Roma also seen as not indigenous to Europe. I'm sorry, Brother Garfield, didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah, so they started painting pictures with hook nose with black people, and Tudor Parfit did an article on it, Are the Jews Black? In I forgot the name of the magazine, and he broke it down why they started saying they were black. Going back to what you said earlier, so they want to say they throw everybody in that color. So anytime I want to denigrate you or down you, I'm gonna call you black.
Bingo. This is how the Indians in Britain became the blacks, right?
So when the African American brothers read it now, when they read all that old stuff from the medieval time and the times that they're doing this, like, oh, the Jews were black. No, they were saying that they were black because they want to put them in a certain class. They would be light and white, as the court case you just mentioned. They were looking white and everything, but they call them black. They call rabbinical Jews or Orthodox Jews black, just to down.
And there is this idea that Jews, because remember, they're coming from Palestine. You know, they're the Palestinians. So we need to change our conception of the Jewish people and think of, what if the Palestinians had gone through Europe and spent 400 years in Europe? That's the Jews. So many of them are still kind of dark. You know, you'll meet Jews who have African features. I've met Jews who some of them I think are mixed race, you know, quite literally. And they're like, you know, no. And so,
don't do it.
Right. And so there is this dark, suave character to some Jews. And of course, many Jews are also come from North Africa.
I'm gonna give a visual right now, a visual example of what we're talking about, right? Excellent. This is right here is a Sephardic type, right at the bottom.
Exactly.
Now, when you look at the bottom part, then you look at this part right now, and look at the Sephardic Jews. They were called dark Negroid features, so they would call
precisely like look at the gentleman on the right and his nose. Now we would call that a black nose, right? Right, I know it's close. It's close.
Look a ship, boy. That's a look a ship.
You know,
that's
their hair
interesting
tends
right
to be
there.
curly.
That's wild. That's a good one, Garfield.
You know, my wife, who is of Russian and Polish ancestry, if I go into a Dominican neighborhood, they always think we're Dominican. That's how dark her features are. Very, quote, Mediterranean.
Yeah, you slipped that one in, Garfield. That was a good left hook to follow up with that punch you just threw. The way you answered that question, that was a good one.
Yep.
Well, these are great questions, brother. I'm very impressed how you guys have really dug into you know, to try to get things right and try to understand our history. I think it's so important. I think it allows us to make choices.
Yes.
You know, when we talk about race as a kind of political concept, remember Obama kind of chose to be a Black American.
Yep.
Right. I mean, right, for the way he was living his life, he kind of positioned himself. It's a political identity. It's a chosen identity. See, that's kind of what I'm trying to say. Like, we all choose it, but most of us really have little choice but to choose it. You know, to the degree that we are in these Black bodies and our experiences reinforce that every single day in our society, every single moment in our society.
Absolutely.
And so, you know, there are things pushing us together so that if I'm in Europe and, you know, I see a brother with dreadlocks across the way, we might wave. You know, especially if we're in a place where you never see Black people. Because of that political understanding that we have something in common. Whether you speak a different language, different culture, different religion, irrelevant, right? This notion that in the colonial world of dark-skinned people like you and I, we share something essential.
Absolutely. Garfield, I cannot believe that you had not been talking about this subject with Dr. Bruce. You was tripping.
Oh,
That's
we
what
had
he
some
do.
great conversations. We had some great conversations.
Oh
Yeah,
man.
no, Brother Garfield has been awesome. You know, we built up to this conversation.
Oh,
I
yeah,
think
built
if we
up
had
to
had this conversation at first, I might have turned off too many people, because I know this is, you know, we live through our Black identities, right?
Absolutely.
And so to hear that, well, this is, you know, Black ain't real, you know, it's cognitive dissonance for people, right? And so I understand that. I understand that. For me, it's about understanding the chosenness of our Black identity, right? In the sense that we are constructing we're the quintessential modern people here in America in terms of being divorced from our past identities and and having pieces of it that we can now reconstruct new understandings of who we are as a people, right? This is what Du Bois and the project has been doing for the past 150 years, right? We've been constructing who we are. And you know, I'm very proud of that rich culture, because it's saved us. You know, the Black church, I'm not part of the church, but I have a lot of respect for the church, because I do not believe we would have survived as a people without the church. We would have been morally defeated. But what allowed, you know, those folks down in South Carolina to turn the other cheek with that crazy boy who shot up that church, that was the power of the Black church to me. That's what has gotten us through the past 400 years.
You got any more questions, Brother Ankh?
No, I told you, the way he answered that last question, I was done. I didn't want to mess it up at that point. At that point, I was like, bet. I mean, because it brought something to it. It brought a hell of a nuance to it, and I think it tied everything together. Just that, man. Yeah, I don't want to mess that up. That was tight.
Thank you, brother. Thank you.
I got a better.
Brother Garfield, I'm so you know, what's the word? Indebted to you for giving me this kind of forum. Because there are many times in this internet age where I have my 20 students and I say, man, I wish I could talk to a bigger audience who would be able to hear the stuff of our culture, of our history. You know, I'm also fascinated with the Latin world. You know, the Afro-Caribbean world is a fascinating cultural world that I feel we have a lot in common with the Latin people that we often miss because we don't understand those West African roots that run through all of our cultures.
Yep.
And so I find that provides the basis for humanity for us all.
Yeah, I appreciate this conversation, man. Real healthy for me. I always like intelligent dialogue, and they say you can always tell like what a person is reading based off their conversation, what level of reading they at, what type of material they delving into, man. When I heard that scientific literacy piece, I was like, but I heard your conversation, so I already understood that. You didn't even have to tell me that you would deal with the scientific aspect of humans. You just the way your mannerisms and the way you were speaking in subject, I understood that even if you did have a religion, you would understand that there's a biological understanding to the situation. So, man, I appreciate the conversation, man.
Thank you for some wonderful questions, brother. This has been, you know, when Brother Garfield invited me, I didn't know there was going to be a third person. So I got a little nervous. I don't know. But I know Brother Garfield, he doesn't ambush me. He wouldn't do that.
No.
And he's spoken so highly about my work. I knew I was going to have some good questions. So this has been a real pleasure, brother, just having this dialogue with you.
Oh, yeah. He read that bio. I was like, yeah, man, we in the midst of a cat and dog fight over racialization, over Black people, and you came right in. And it's my birthday weekend, and I appreciate this, Garfield. Couldn't have been a better present to give me an expert that understands that. Man, that was a good one. The gift that keeps giving. That's all I can say, bro. That's all I can tell you. Yeah.
Hey, again, ladies and gentlemen, this is
happy birthday, brother.
Bruce B. Haynes, and this book on the screen, The Soul of Judaism. Get you a copy. I got me a hard copy, plus I got it on Kindle. So in case somebody debate me or something, I said, let me pull up the book right here. I got it right here. I got it right here on the phone, on the Kindle. So, Dr. Bruce Haynes, again, my brother, I appreciate you taking the time out late on a Saturday evening to do this wonderful interview. I think I'm gonna throw it up probably tomorrow. I'm gonna throw it up on Ank's birthday, man. I'm gonna say this is for Ankh.
Awesome. Well, I hope it's a great year ahead for you, brother. You start the year with some awesome questions and some deep thinking. This is what we need in our Black world. Absolutely. To be really quite frank with you, I am frustrated by our inability to just speak truth when we look at it. That's what we're getting out of the Republican Party. They tell us, we see it, and they tell us it's something else. So to be able to come with that honesty, to be willing to go where the facts take you. That is that will be our liberation as a people. That is what we need as a people. That approach to the world.
All right. Thank you, my brother. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Did over an hour, longer than I thought, but hey, it's been good.
That was good.
Thank you. Let me just put an end to this recording right now. Thank you again, my brother.